kind of person who shoots first and asks questions later, mostly because I feel really bad when I mess up, and then I really hate the whole apology thing afterwards. But I'm not the kind of guy who really kind of shoots first, asks questions later. I'm the kind of guy who waits too long to solve anything, and then either it solves itself or I miss an opportunity, but that's just kind of how I work. That's really just my personality. But sometimes, problems do tend to fix themselves, sometimes, when you do nothing. Have you guys ever experienced that? You freak out, you worry, you do all this kind of stuff, and you realize, man, had I just done nothing, everything would have been great. No? Okay. You should try it sometime. Sometimes it works. I happen to marry someone who's the opposite of that, who is very great at being proactive and getting things done, maybe reacting a little bit too much when things need to be done. So we had before we got married, we never fought. It was great. And then right before we got married, we had our first fight, which was fantastic. I was like, yes, we're a normal couple. This is good. I was so scared that I was setting up these real unrealistic expectations. Anyways, so right before we got married, we were looking for a place to live. We were kind of deciding, I think we decided on Oregon, and we're trying to figure out where exactly in Oregon we wanted to live. We're like, okay, we're looking at the Beaverton area because that's where all the Asians are and things like that. And you laugh, but it's real. I mean, just look around, guys, seriously. That's not what I'm talking about. We were looking around, that's not important. We were looking for apartments, and Maureen, who is in California at this time, Maureen's my wife, in case you guys don't know, some random person. Maureen's my wife, but not wife at that time, is looking for an apartment, and she's got 10 plus different places on her spreadsheet, which is how she operates. She has a spreadsheet, and she's stressed about that. She's finishing school, and then she's also apartment, school. Oh yeah, planning our wedding. Yeah, that's what's going on. And I'm trying to study for my stuff, and she's trying not to bother me, but she's getting stressed and freaking out about it. And so we had a conversation, which did not turn into a conversation. It was our lovely first fight, and it was great. Her best friend wanted to kill me. It was amazing. So we decided to kind of after that conversation, we decided to sort of table it and say, hey, we're not even in the time to really decide where or what. Let's wait. Let's see what kind of falls into place. Maureen has a job interview up in the area, so she actually comes up, and while she was here, she said, hey, there's this one apartment that I looked at. Why don't we go check in and try to apply? And so we go to this apartment, and they have one opening, and we like it. We're like, okay, price is pretty good, location is fantastic. Why don't we try to apply? And we needed paperwork signed. They didn't have it electronically, so she had to expedite her paperwork, paid $8 to get it shipped here as fast as possible. I signed it. I drove up the speed limit to the place, and turned it in, and after we turned it in, it finds out we were a day too late or something like that. It was already with someone else. And so that was kind of a bummer, but when we had visited that location, we found out that there was an apartment complex across the street. And we're just like, okay, well, we like the location. We went, we checked it out, we applied online, and they never got back to us. So we waited a bit, and we called, and they're like, oh yeah, we're just checking your references, and they were like, when do you want to move in? And we're like, oh, wow. So it all kind of worked out really, really well without all of the stress and all the panicking. It's amazing what can happen sometimes. The point being is sometimes the best thing to do is nothing new, right? Maybe y'all don't agree with me on that one, but I might convince you otherwise. We're looking at Daniel 6 today. We're going through the book of Daniel, and Pastor Jeff had mentioned how the last sermon was probably the most well-known story of Daniel. This is probably the runner-up, if not also the most well-known story. Daniel 6 is often called Daniel in the Lion's Den, right? I think that's a pretty boring title. I like to call it Old Man Dan and the Big Hungry Cats. It sounds cooler. So Pastor Thomas, when he preached, he ended chapter 5. We are beginning chapter 6. The ending of chapter 5 is important because it is the backstory for the beginning of chapter 6. So I shall read to you the ending of chapter 5. And it says, that very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 26 years old. I love that. Such a wonderful way to start a story. Murder. Makes a great intro. So at this point in Daniel's life, the empire of Babylon has just fallen and was overthrown by the combined Medo-Persian Empire. So the previous world power at the time is now being swallowed up by the new world power. So chapter 6 then begins and says this, "And it pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be throughout the whole kingdom, and over them 3 high officials, of whom Daniel was one, to whom these satraps should give an account, so the king might suffer no loss. Then this Daniel became distinguished above all the other officials and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom." So what's probably happening here is Darius is now in control of this new empire, and he is reestablishing the government to prevent loss. He's organizing things, right? He's reorganizing stuff, hopefully to prevent any sort of uprising, but more importantly, to make sure that you will receive all of your taxes, right? It would be such a shame if all of a sudden, the government forgot to take some taxes, right? We couldn't live with that. So Daniel is given a place of authority in this new kingdom, and there's no actual explanation on why, but we followed the life of Daniel. We've seen this story. We see what he's capable of doing. It's like, yeah, no duh, they're going to put him in this place of authority. But it says that he was distinguished because of his excellent spirit. I just want to point out that this isn't something super mystical that's happening right here. Like, it's not because, his excellent spirit is just code word for Daniel had superpowers. That's not what's going on here. It really is saying that he's really good at what he's doing. Daniel's good at his job. Yes, it involves God, but it is his natural skills combined with God's favor and empowerment. He's so good at what he does that the king is already planning to promote him. A little bit more backstory on this. Daniel is 80 years old at this time. That's why it's Old Man Dan. He's 80 years at this time, and he is still a freaking machine and wizard of administration. This is what's going on. But this isn't something he just learned in his old age. It's being put up here at the end of his life, but excellence is something that Daniel has shown his entire life. From youth, we see that in Daniel 1:3-4, he was of exemplary qualities. I'm not going to read the passage because I want to make sure we get out in time. But he also, throughout the rest of his life, Daniel 1:19-20 and 5:11-14 are great examples of, again, the quality of Daniel above everybody else. And now in his final years, it also says in Daniel 6:3, he was of an excellent spirit. In his entire life, most of which he was a captive foreigner, he displays incredible ability, integrity, and insight. Serving God meant doing his best wherever God had placed him. He's 80 years old, right? And he has served every kingdom, Judah, Babylon, now Persia. Even these pagan kings, he's served them faithfully. He's 80 and he's still one of the best, and they want to promote him. Yes, God's favor was on Daniel and placing him into key positions of influence and authority, but I don't want us to over-mystify Daniel's ability. Sometimes we want to think he's overly special because he's a Bible character. Daniel's not a fictional character. He's a real person, a real man with real abilities and struggles and insight. He really lived. He had to work through this stuff. He's also not a puppet. He's not just this empty shell that God just moves around to make things happen. He's also not lazy. This doesn't just come magically to him. He had to study. We see that he was studying in the earlier chapters, and that's when he was able to prove that he was 10 times greater than all the other magicians and astrologers, but it's because of the effort they put in, empowered by God, of course. But it wasn't just a freebie. His whole life he lived exemplary. Daniel 6, I think, asks us this question and answers this for us, is how do we as people, how do we as believers remain faithful in an ever-shifting world? This is the third major change in Daniel's life, going from Judah to an exile. Kingdom of Babylon to Persia. Maybe that's the second major shift. Anyways, it's a huge change. Third kingdom. We can stay consistent in a shifting world because we trust in an unshakable God. And throughout this story, Daniel shows us these things. And he shows us in how he is faithful with everything God has given him anywhere God has placed him. Right? It didn't matter what he had or where he was, because guess what? God doesn't change. This is the reason Daniel became distinguished above the rest. It's because he works for a different reason. As believers, we work differently. We don't strive for something that's going to fade away. Everything else can shake around us, but the kingdom of God remains. We have this extra primary purpose called the glory of God. Are you faithful with where and what God has given you? Are you able to be distinguished because of how you choose to live, how you choose to work? Can others see the difference in you because they can tell you're not after approval? You're not after a good pat on the back or an attaboy. You're not after a paycheck or the things that money can buy. You're not after fame, respect, or reputation. I'm not saying any of these things are bad, but they're not the primary motivator. They're not the main factor in the purpose of what we do. I'm not saying overwork yourself. Don't become a workaholic. But we work differently because we believe we are working for God and not man. I remember someone gave me an illustration of how they live their life in a way to reflect the scripture when it says, everything you do, do to the glory of God. And then say, I imagine that in everything that I do, I'm getting paid like $2,000 an hour or something ridiculous. I just imagine that. And that mentality is how I choose to respond. And if the gifts that God has given us in salvation, all that stuff, if we were to think, how should we respond to working, doing everything in the way that we would have done for God, that's not a bad idea. Imagining that, what does a $2,000 per hour paycheck look like? 1 hour of work, that's what it looks like for me. But that's how we respond as if, right? Wherever God has placed us and whatever he has given us and all that we do for the glory of God. That does not change. That is a kingdom that cannot be shaken. Those are treasures that cannot be removed, right? Because he doesn't change. He doesn't get weak. He doesn't become overthrown. We can be consistent in our ever-changing world. God is not asking you to be the very best. He's asking you to give your best because you're doing it for him. And he deserves your best. We can remain consistently faithful in our ever-shifting world because we trust in an unshakable God. Daniel shows us this, that he was faithful with everything God gave him and anywhere God has placed him. The story continues and it says that the high officials and satraps sought to find grounds of complaint against Daniel with regards to the kingdom, but they could find no ground for complaint or any fault because he was faithful and no error or fault was found in him. Now the villains of the story are introduced. His co-workers, his peers. I gotta say, when I was starting to study this, I'm like, man, you've got to be pretty messed up to be like, I'm going to murder an 80-year-old man because I want his job, right? Just wait like a year and the position will open up. Like, I don't know what the hurry was, but maybe they were old themselves. I don't know. Daniel's enemies didn't hate him for no reason, but I do want to point something out. They didn't hate Daniel because of his faith. I mean, Bible says we will be hated because of following Jesus, but that's actually not what's happening in this situation. Daniel's devotion to Yahweh wasn't the problem that they had. They hated him out of jealousy. Yes, God is a big factor because Daniel's great at what he does because he serves God, but it wasn't because of God they hated him. They wanted to stop the promotion that Daniel had. Daniel's main problem, if he is to have one, is he's just too good at his job. Like, he's a rule follower, and his enemies are trying to find something or anything to fault him for doing his job and how he's doing his job, and it says that they can't find any reason. How do we stay consistent and faithful in an ever-shifting world? It's because we trust in an unshakable God. And how Daniel shows us this is that he served with integrity. See, others were willing to lie and scheme, and spoiler alert, they're going to try to kill him, and even murder for his position. Contrary, Daniel just decides to serve with integrity. I'm just going to do the job the way it should be done. Do it in a way that is pleasing to God. Because for Daniel, it wasn't about being the best leader. It wasn't about the power and the privilege of the position. It wasn't self-promotion, personal interest, or even personal preservation. Right? He gets hooked up with some pretty good stuff. Like if you read the book, like in chapter 5, he gets like a really sweet purple robe and I think like a golden chain necklace. He gets hooked up with pretty good stuff. He actually has like a 2-story house, which is great at that time period, I'm also at. He gets good stuff. But in everything he did, he does it with integrity, and those things were never the goal. You read through Daniel and you realize he told the truth when God revealed things to him. He spoke boldly to kings, like things where it's like, dude, you can't say that because that's bad news and they'll cut your head off, right? Like he spoke boldly because he didn't care. He was just, this is what God has revealed. This is what it means. And he worked in integrity that there's nothing that they can accuse him of. He wasn't interested in building the kingdom of the Babylonians or the Medo-Persians or even his own. Because these kingdoms require scheming and clawing and cleverness and the abuse of others and taking advantage of others for your own self-interest. Why? Because all of these other kingdoms are frail and they're weak and they're fragile and they're threatened. They're here today and they're gone tomorrow, so you have to fight just to preserve it. You need to trust in a feeble and falling system. And if you try to be too fair, if you try to be too good, someone's going to take advantage of you. So you got to get them before they get you. The reality in our lives is that you can get ahead by taking advantage of other people. You can get ahead by abusing the system. We can questionably bend things to put ourselves in an advantageous position. But what is revealed is that we trust in our own cleverness and our own ingenuity for our success and self-preservation. A little bit of lying, a little bit of tweaking, a little bit of bending the rules, a little bit of subversion. That is how you can survive in this worldly system because it is shaky. But that is not so in the kingdom of God. Daniel never cared about the promotions. He didn't care about holding his place. He lived to please God. I heard a story recently, and I tried really hard to track down where I heard it from, but I cannot remember. So if you were with me somehow when this story came out, you can tell me, hey, this person said it. But I heard a story recently of a real estate agent who was working at a particular company where they used, I don't know if it's questionable methods. Maybe the real estate agents can tell me here whether or not it's true or not. But they would bend things to get more clients and to get more sales. And the real estate agent, being a believer, did not feel comfortable with that. But the company they're working with was one of the most successful companies in the area. So eventually they transferred to a less successful company, less money, not getting as many clients, but they operated with integrity. The end. Like that's the story. I'm not, did God bless them with, I don't know. But they chose to make the sacrifice. Said, I'm not going to live this way. I'm going to live in a way that is pleasing to God, and there's a peace and there's security in that. Sure, I could make more money. I don't know. Maybe they're making less. Maybe they're living in a cardboard box now. I don't know how that worked out. But their decision was, I'm going to live in a way that is pleasing to God because that's what I trust in. And that's why I can choose to live in a way, even though it might not get me ahead. That doesn't matter. Do you trust in the unshakable God and his kingdom? Do you live with integrity, honesty, morality, virtue, trustworthiness, upright, godly, fair? Really, the question is, do you trust that God is going to take care of you? Living God's way, living with integrity doesn't always get us ahead. But that is not the point. It's about resting in the care of God, knowing that come what may, he does not become shaken. We rest in that. We build upon that foundation. We can be faithful and consistent in an ever-shifting world by trusting in our unshakable God. And we trust in him by serving with integrity. The story continues, and it says that these men said, "We shall not find any grounds for complaint against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God." Then these high officials and satraps came by agreement to the king and said to him, "O King Darius, live forever. All the high officials of the kingdom and prefects and satraps and the counselors and the governors are agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction that whoever makes petition to any god or man for 30 days except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions." These guys didn't breathe. "Now, O king, establish the injunction inside the document so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked." Therefore, King Darius signed the document and injunction. When Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went to the house where he had a window in his upper chamber, because he's rich, open towards Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed to give thanks before his God as he had done previously. Then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and plea before his God. Then they came near and said to the king concerning the injunction, "O king, did you not sign an injunction that anyone who makes petition to any god or man within 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions?" The king answered and said, "That thing stands fast according to the laws of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked." Then they answered and said to the king, "Well, Daniel, who was one of the exiles from Judah," which was like 60 years ago. They're just like bringing up old garbage. "Exiles from Judah pays no attention to you, O king, or the injunction you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day." I mean, if they're not making it clear in the repeated phrases these guys are wormy, you know. If I was to give them a voice, they'd be very, is sleazy the right word? That's probably not the right word. They're just really weird, nasally kind of sounding. What a bunch of snitches, right? Right, let's just be honest. These guys are a bunch of snitches. You know how it goes. Snitches get eaten by lions. Right. So, the only way Daniel's enemies could find a way to trap him was because of his regular, public, and undying devotion to Yahweh. That's the dirt they had on him. Wow, that's bad. Right? Check out Daniel's response. In the face of death threats, he doesn't do anything new. Studying this, I was like, I know we're supposed to really like Daniel, but he is the most boring main character in any story because he doesn't do anything. Like, he just keeps going on like nothing has happened. It's like, wow, they're trying to kill you. What are you going to do? Nothing. I'm going to live my normal day. And Daniel did nothing. You know, like that's what's going on. But anyways, how do we remain consistently faithful in our ever-shifting world is by trusting in our unshakable God. And Daniel shows this trust by his regular, public, and unyielding devotion to Yahweh. Everybody knows that old man Dan lives for the glory of God. He's predictable. They know what lines he won't cross. They know that if they force him to choose between God or something else, he will always pick God. We know Daniel. Nothing comes between him and his relationship with God. It's an obvious, painfully obvious setup. And Daniel just walks right into it like a dummy, right? He's not. You'll find out later. Are you that predictable? Are you that easy to trap? If you didn't change anything about the way that you lived, right now, would it be clear that you have a regular, public, and unyielding devotion to Yahweh? Or as the famous question goes, if you were arrested for being a Christian, would there be enough evidence to convict you? Another thought is if society itself was to turn very hostile to Jesus, how much would you need to change to blend in? What would you have to change? Or if you were to simply stop believing in Jesus today, how much of your life changes? I like these thought experiments because it reveals to ourselves what we have not built upon Christ. If my life is built on the foundation of Jesus, then it cannot stand without him. If he disappears from the equation, things should crumble. But what remains? That's what's not built on him. A life without God is not a life at all. I'm all about being relevant for culture. I really am. I think we should be relatable in some way and not weird. But sometimes I'm not super sure what makes us different. Like we could have been a little legalistic in the past, but the nice thing about legalism is there's distinction. We don't stand out anymore, right? I'm not saying go and be weird. Please don't do that. That's the bad, wrong kind of standing out. But if this thing works, right, if Jesus is real, if salvation works, then I want to see it work. I want to see transformed lives. See, Christianity is not just a fan club. It's not a title. It is the cure. But if it is the cure, then why do we all too often look just as sick as everybody else? I want to see, I want to experience, and I want to live the transformed life that Jesus has. Are you regular, public, and unyielding in your devotion to Yahweh? In other words, are you willing to go all in and experience the reality of this transformed life? Everything that God has for us. Another thing I want to note about this passage is that Daniel's defiance wasn't about being disrespectful. It was about his duty and devotion to God. See, he doesn't do anything, but he doesn't go out of his way to say or do anything. I think it's important for us to note that we shouldn't confuse devotion to God with disrespecting those who oppose us. Because how you talk about your enemies tells what you believe about your God. And my God is not that petty. He's not that weak. I have to go make fun of my enemies. God is not surprised or threatened by these evil schemes, and Daniel knows that. And he trusts in the control of God. I also think he's like 80 years old and probably thought eaten by lions is a pretty sick way to go. He's like, that's a cool ending to my story. I'm gonna open my window extra big when I pray. Bring it on. It's a great ending to my chapter. Dang it. There's what is it? 6 more chapters in my book? I can't die here. Sorry. We can remain consistently faithful in this ever-shifting world because we trust in an unshakable God. Daniel shows this trust through his regular, public, and unyielding devotion to Yahweh. It says here, then the king, when he heard these words, was much distressed and set his mind to deliver Daniel. And he labored till the sun went down to rescue him. Then these men came by agreement to the king and said to him, know, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and the Persians, and no injunction or ordinance that the king established can be changed. Then the king commanded, and Daniel was brought and cast into the den of lions. And the king declared to Daniel, may your God, whom you continually serve continually deliver you. And a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet and in the signet of the Lord's, that nothing could be changed concerning Daniel. Then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and sleep fled from him. Then at daybreak the king arose and went in haste to the den of lions. And he came near to the den where Daniel was, and he cried out in a tone of anguish. The king declared to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions? I mean, I would just been like, Daniel, you okay? That's a very long way to say it. Anyways, then Daniel said to the king, O king, live forever. My God sent his angels and shut the lion's mouth, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him and also before you. O king, I have done no harm. Then the king was exceedingly glad and commanded that Daniel be taken out of the den. So Daniel was taken out of the den, and no crimes of harm were found on him, because he had trusted in his God. And the king commanded that those men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and cast in the den of lions, they, their children, and their wives. And before they reached the bottom of the den, the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces. What a happy ending. And the lions lived happily ever after. They were satisfied, right? Like, let's celebrate by throwing. Anyways, so what's clear here is that Daniel is not disrespecting the king. His intentions were not to disrespect the king, and the king did not feel that way about the way Daniel responded. Darius who is the king of the most powerful empire in the world at that time, does everything he can to save Daniel. But he can't. He was incredibly anxious about Daniel's situation. He was anxious about losing Daniel. The enemies had made the perfect trap. There's no way to get him out of it. Right? We got him. You know, lions, when they're hungry, they eat people. It's foolproof. The greatest power of humanity cannot save you. The most powerful of the king of the most powerful empire in the world could do nothing. The greatest schemes of evil cannot defeat God. The strongest beasts cannot overpower God's purposes. How do we remain consistently faithful in an ever-shifting world as we trust in an unshakable God? Daniel shows us this by living for the glory of God alone. When he's pulled out of the pit, he says, I was unharmed because I was found blameless before him. It's not, man, those lions were not hungry today. Or they're so hungry, they're all dead. Right? He said, it was because I was blameless before God and also before you. And because he had trusted in his God. The only factor that mattered to Daniel was God's opinion. All the scheming, the accusations, the hungry lions, none of that matters. He lives to please God and God alone. He works with excellence and integrity for God. His regular life reflects devotion to God. And in his crisis moment, it wasn't about the plots of the enemy or the power of the king or the terror of lions. It's about how did I stand before God? See, Daniel's name means God is my judge. What a perfect name. How fitting is it? God and God alone do I stand before. Do I measure my life? Daniel's the most boring main character. He doesn't do anything. It's almost like he functions as a support character. Because I think he is. God is the main character of the story. Daniel isn't the hero. He's a supporting cast. He's the rescue character. The Daniel in distress, I guess. Damn. That was rough. Our lives are the supporting roles in whatever chapter of God we find ourselves in. He wins, and so do we by sticking with him. God's opinion is the only one that matters, and Daniel lives for the glory of God alone. The entire time, Daniel is just living normally because he lives in a way that pleases God. He says, I'm doing what's right. I'm doing what's right according to God. I don't need to change. The world is frantic. It's changing. Everything's moving. People are scheming and plotting. None of that matters. His enemies plot, scheme, lie, only to end up destroying themselves, and God is glorified. We can remain consistently faithful in our ever-shifting world because we trust in our unshakable God. And we know Daniel shows us this by living for the glory of God alone. Oh, yes. 12:15. That's the time we call the worship team up. That's the cue, guys. You can come up. That was a big sigh, man. Sorry about that. No, sorry. God is a God of great reversals. Evil tries its best and only succeeds in its destroying itself. We just finished a study on the book of Habakkuk, and that's another big theme, and that of how, I'm almost done, it's okay. It's another big theme of how evil does all it can to succeed and to strive, and it only builds up its own power to destroy itself, and God just sits there and remains in control. Even the greatest evil that mankind has ever done, that is to kill the perfect and innocent Son of God, God himself, turned out to be our salvation. It was reversed, turned on its head. People schemed against him. Pontius Pilate couldn't save him, but it turned into our salvation, the salvation of all of humanity. Our God cannot be bested. He cannot lose. The worst of the worst gets turned on his head for his purposes and his glory. All of this doesn't threaten God. How do believers remain consistently faithful as we trust in our unshakable God? Look at the ending. Look at the proclamation that Darius has. that closes out this chapter. And it says, "Then King Darius wrote to all the people, nations, and language that dwelt in the earth, 'Peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion there shall be no end, shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of lions.' And so Daniel prospered the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian." This is our God, and this is his kingdom. All the striving, all the plotting, all the anxiety, none of that mattered. Daniel didn't have to change a thing, because God's kingdom is unshakable. And we can remain consistently faithful in this tense, shifting world, because we're built upon an unshakable kingdom, an unshakable God. Amen. Let us, cute little beep. Let us respond by declaring this truth. A part of how we stand upon this is worship, is praise. Does singing songs really change our situation? Yes, it does. Because we're declaring the truth and we're standing firm upon the God who cannot be shaken. Let's respond that way.